and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Professor Senja Chmut, and I'm Director of the IIS. And it's really wonderful to see so many of you today in the International House. Also, lots of people joining us online today. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome our alumna IIS fellow, Yolandi Berger. Thank you so much for joining again today. It's always so wonderful to host you and wonderful to have your conversations with you. So thank you for coming and organizing this panel at the IIS today. I'm sure you all have lots of fun today. It's going to be a fantastic conversation, discussion, I'm sure, as always, with this group of people. It's never boring. We've had them before. Hopefully we'll have them again here at the IIS. Just a couple of housekeeping rules for those of you online. If you have any comments, just please post them in the Q&A section. We are monitoring the chat. The discussion, the panel is recorded. But of course, if there is anything that we need to edit out, please let us know afterwards. If there are questions in the room, there will be opportunity, but also over the lunchtime, there will be opportunity for conversation. So without any further ado, Yolandi, over to you.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yolandi Berger, and I've been awarded the title of the Alumni IIS Fellow, which hasn't existed before today. So I'm really honored to be chairing this wonderful panel today with brilliant speakers on them. So I'm a research fellow at the School of Design and Creative Arts here at Loughborough University. And today is also my first day as a postdoctoral fellow at the GCRO with the University of Johannesburg. And I work at the intersection of graphic heritage and storytelling. Hopefully, Mike. And so I'm really delighted to be joined by these four brilliant researchers and people working in their own field and discipline. And just to begin today's session, I'm going to invite, so this is just me, so I would like to invite the rest of the panel just to have quick introductions to who they are. I've put on the slides their bios as it is on the website, but just to hear it from themselves, who they are, what are they doing, and what is the lens that they're bringing to today's discussion. Okay, so over to you, Mike.
All right, okay, well, hello, I'm Mike Wilson. I'm Professor of Drama here at Loughborough. I'm also Director of the Storytelling Academy, which is one of our, which is research teaching centre, I suppose, or a collective of colleagues interested in applied storytelling. So the use of storytelling as a way of thinking, as a way of knowing the world, and applying that to real world problems and challenges, particularly ways of bringing either underrepresented or underheard voices into critical discussions around some of the global challenges that we face. I'm also recently appointed as UNESCO chair in storytelling education for sustainability, and I'm still learning what that is at the moment. So that's exciting, but it actually helps us think about the international visibility and impact of our work as much as anything else, and we're focusing on projects in India, in Africa, and in the Arctic nations as well. Those are three areas. What I am not is an urbanist at all, but I am rapidly learning about urbanism from people like Yolandi and Rob and their research, and how that fits into the agenda, into the discussions and discourses around storytelling. So Yolandi very kindly sort of said, I'm here as a speaker, but I'm actually here as a listener, more importantly than as a speaker, because I want to learn from these people.
Thank you, Mike. So over to you, Taimaz.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Taimaz, and I'm a senior lecturer in urban planning in the School of Architecture, Building and Civil Engineering at Loughborough University. My background is urban planning, regional development, and urban design. And I'm the policy committee member of Royal Town Planning Institute, and we are helping the government specifically about policies related to housing inequality in the context of UK. My research is mainly around digital urban planning and digitalization of the UK planning system. And I'm leading a national platform called Colouring Britain, together with colleagues from Alan Turing Institute. So Colouring Cities platform is an open source platform that is publicly available. All the codes and data there are reproducible. You can share them, download them, and use them in different contexts. We collect data in 12 categories and 47 subcategories. And apart from the national context, we have now more than 30 countries involved around the world, more than 150 researchers across the world with various backgrounds. And one of our newest additions is South Africa, Colouring South Africa, that we are working together with Yolandi and her team. And hopefully we will get it up and running very soon. And I'm working with Rob on the Impact Hub project. And as a part of that, we've created a town observatory, which I would love if you could just go and check the website and give us feedback about the user friendliness of it and about how we can improve that project, because we still have less than a year to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamas. Over to you, Melinda.
Thanks, Yolandi, and thanks so much for hosting us. It's absolutely delightful to be here. Such a privilege. And I've been hosted by Dr. Robert Harland, who is the head of the Department of Design and Creative Arts, and Yolandi for that matter, as part of a knowledge exchange project that we've been jointly part of. I work as an operations and partnerships manager for the Gauteng City Region Observatory, one of the 9 provinces in South Africa. And this learning between the town observatory and the Gauteng City Region Observatory has been so extraordinary, something I didn't quite expect. And when you're working with excellence, one is always going to have unexpected outcomes. And I think the fact that we work with a population of over 16 million versus the small population of Loughborough hasn't in any way impacted on those learnings, other than by pointing out the many similarities. Which I think has been, I will say, a little surprising, and has opened up our minds to bringing on board this notion of heritage into our urban observatory, which we realize we've been doing, but we just didn't call it that. And maybe that's the next step, the interesting next step around intersectionality and how different observatories work with things. I would like to acknowledge our executive director, Rashid Sirat, who I'm hoping is online, and any of my colleagues from the Gauteng City Region Observatory. It's a small research organization that is a really interesting association between the provincial government, the municipalities, the University of Johannesburg, as Yolandi's already mentioned, and we hosted at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And so it is a very interesting kind of governance structure for an observatory where all partners are embedded and in, is probably the best way to put it. I won't tell you all about the research, other than to say, as I said to Tamas earlier, that you could just as well be working in the GCRO. There's so many shared research interests, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go through the questions. But I think what is particular about us is, even though we're a small organization of 20 people, I'm privileged to work with such excellence. And I'm sure I've heard from everybody I've spoken to that is the name of the game here as well. And so whilst we are working on very careful academic evidence-based research, the important part is that we also are working in the policy space to advise our colleagues in the policy space. And one of the words we like to use is co-production. And it's an easy word and quite a hard action. So that is something that we really pursue, because whilst we are completely independent, we are also tremendously invested in the success of governance, given our country and where we are in history. So, yes, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a privilege.
Welcome, Melinda. Over to you, Rob.
I'm Robert Harlan. I'm a reader in urban graphic heritage here at this lovely university. I'll start by saying thanks to Yolandi for convening this panel. It's really quite significant because it really starts, I think, the next phase of our collaboration. I think the notion of urban places as narrative spaces. We've been discussing that now for perhaps a year or so, sharing those thoughts with Mike, wondering how that could become more integral in the Storytelling Academy, overlapping with the projects that are already being done, such as the Treescapes project that Mike's involved with. So it seems to be a very interesting fit, but also very exciting in terms of how we see that maybe developing over the next sort of 4 to 5 years. I sometimes struggle with my identity professionally. Usually the term I come up with is party organizer. I think that probably captures what I do. But in reality, my background is in graphic design practice for 15 years in London. Then I did a PhD in architecture. Then I started to write about the relationship between graphic design and urban design. Then I stumbled across heritage as a theme at AHRC several years ago and thought, oh, actually, those things I'm looking at have got quite a strong heritage component, which I hadn't realized before. And I'd written about an awful lot, but just hadn't thought to talk about those things in relation to heritage. And that seemed to kind of spark this sort of new notion of graphic heritage, urban heritage, and sort of that sort of direction. And actually, more recently, that started to take on a narrative component. So my early interest was in objects. We then collaborated with another colleague as part of our sort of informal group called Alison Barnes, who started to talk much more about meaning. So I was interested in the meanings. Alison brought the meanings to that conversation. And then Yolandi came on board and started to talk about the measure and the impact of those things. So we kind of work on this 3M model now, which is means, measures, so means, meaning, and measure. We love kind of those sort of alphabetic kind of conundrums like that. The work, I guess, that we're doing now is sort of venturing into new territory, really through the collaboration with people like Tamas at the Town Observatory. And that stems from about 10 years ago, I was involved in sort of setting up something called the Leicester Urban Observatory, which is a volunteer sort of relationship and association with several universities in Leicestershire, but also the City Council, head of planning and City Council. And that sort of happened for several years. I think we used to organise various things. And then we had the opportunity to be part of the university's funding application, or part of the town's funding application for the town deal, which then funded and supported the idea of a town observatory. And so for the last 2.5 years or so, we've been working on establishing and setting that up. And of course, that's led to all sorts of other interesting projects about narrative spaces and places, which we're involved in now. It's introduced us to collaboration with the Department of Computer Science and working on AI. So there's a whole host of sort of new things that are starting to emerge, which I think speak to this notion of, you know, urban places as narrative spaces. And we like rhyming as well, so places and spaces. So we're really, really excited to be, you know, at this sort of critical moment, and I think the Storytelling Academy is about evolution as well, to be part of, you know, the opportunity to shape some of that thinking in the future as well. So looking forward very much to this session, but also lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience as well. I have to say, it's great to see you all. I feel like we're already well connected. This is a really interesting community of practice, if I can use the sort of contemporary sort of word at the moment.
Thank you, Rob. So as you can see, there's a really strong linkage that's starting, or new research theme that's starting to emerge from just the panel introductions around how urban storytelling, graphic heritage, urbanism, the urban environment, the Storytelling Academy, and how all of that can link into a new research agenda that's going to flow, that's actually starting now, which we hope will be really interesting for some of you to follow. So let's begin with the foundational question to today's discussion. And this will anchor all the discussions that's going to flow from this point. And as you're sitting in the audience or listening online, you can maybe answer this question for yourself so long. before we ask the panel members to answer it. And the question is, what might we expect to learn about a place when visiting a place named after them? And this was the question that started the original research in 2020. And it's all started at Nelson Mandela Park in Leicester. So I thought to use this image since this was the real starting point of many of the discussions that came after that time. And this is just one example of a place that was named after Nelson Mandela here in the UK. And there's absolutely a world named after Nelson Mandela. But just as such, there's so many places, streets, buildings, art spaces, bridges, so human geography that's named after people that you know that had an impact. Yesterday we were at Lord's Cricket Ground, and that is named after someone. That name comes from somewhere. And I'm going to share that question one more last time, and then Kieran can take it off for us. And then I want to ask, is there anyone that would like to open answering this question, or should I prompt you? Okay, yes,
Yeah,
so
I'd have to
Rob.
say a few words. So what's interesting about that question is it's a generalized version of actually an earlier conversation, which was specifically about Nelson Mandela Park. So in our very early conversations, when Yolandi came literally into a meeting and said, I just walked through a place called Nelson Mandela Park, something like that. Why is there a place in Leicester called after Nelson Mandela? What's the point? So that was a really kind of interesting question. Of course, we generalized that and thought, wow, this is really interesting, because you could say that about any place in the world, you know, whether it's Martin Luther King Way. There's loads of places in America named after Martin Luther King. You could talk about that in relation to Gandhi, all sorts of prominent figures all over the world. We've all been to these places, and we sort of explore this notion of, you know, how can those places become educational spaces? How could school teachers take children to do history lessons in those places, particularly in a place like a park, you know? And yet when we went and visited that place, what we saw was a very small brass plaque that was barely readable, certainly when the sun was shining on it. And the sort of commemoration and the communication of that person in that space was not very effective, we thought. In fact, we learned more by the bus stop signs, I think, that were surrounding the perimeter, which is taking us off in another direction now to do with transportation. But it kind of raised this interesting question. And perhaps the last thing I would say is that we then started to look at that issue in the Gauteng city region. And 2 out of the 6 locations we look at really stand out. There's a sort of a shopping square called Nelson Mandela Square, I think, in Sandton. And that's a kind of very private sort of space in the sense that there's lots of shops there. There's heavily security, sort of lots of security guards. When you go there, there's an abundance of stuff about Nelson Mandela. It's being used to sort of populate the space and inform the space. Then if you go from there to Nelson Mandela Park in a place called Mamelodi, which is a township in Pretoria, there's 1 sign, 2 signs, which basically just say Nelson Mandela Park. And if you can't speak English, you can't even read that. So it's a very interesting kind of set of contrasts between those 2 locations. Now, the interesting thing about that is Nelson Mandela actually visited the park and opened the park with a speech. And that speech is in the Nelson Mandela Foundation archive, sorry, Nelson Mandela Centre of Memory archive. The Sandton one, I don't think he has any connection with at all, if I'm right. So there's this sort of sense of authenticity and connection between a place, the person it's named after, and what we learn about them. So we've been preoccupied with this now for several years, and we think there's another several years left in it, particularly when we start talking about this in relation to place narrative, storytelling, commemoration, and those kind of things. So I'll say no more there, but fascinating kind of topic with them.
Famous.
Just to add to what Rob mentioned, which was really interesting, I wanted to say the name of places is not just a representative of that specific person that a place was named after. Of course, it's an opportunity to learn about that person, but also this is a great opportunity for us to know more about the political standing of those people who've named that place after a person. Also looking at sometimes even the religious beliefs of people, or cultural background, historical background of people. So it says a lot more than just that person about the background of those people. I'll give you an example. I think a good example of this is what happened in Glasgow in 1980s. The local authorities decided to name a place after Nelson Mandela whilst he was still imprisoned in South Africa, which was a bold decision because the place, the square that they named after Nelson Mandela was where the embassy of South Africa was based at. The consulate, sorry, was based at. So they were sending a very clear message back then that they are against what is happening in South Africa. That was an interesting example showing the political standing. Another example is what is happening in Iran at the moment. So when the regime changed in Iran from monarchy to Islamic Republic regime, many names of locations. One study showed about 76% of places' names have changed massively. There were names that were linked to royal family that changed to names, either religious names or names that were associated with people who initiated Islamic Republic regime. But the irony of it is that people decided to refuse those names. So renaming a place doesn't always work. People might use it as a way to oppose the government. So people still, after 45 years of Islamic Republic regime change, they still name those buildings and places after monarchy family, royal family, and they refuse to name them after an Ayatollah, which sends a clear message there. And finally, again, in the context of Middle East, what is happening is many places are named after the Islamic leaders and after key religious figures, which sends a signal that these are holy cities. So anybody who is familiar with that context, if they hear those religious names, immediately they will know that they are in a holy city, which sends them a signal that they should behave in a certain way, they should dress up in a certain way. So these are all different associations with a person's name.
Okay. Melinda? Yes, gosh, you know, when this question was posed to us yesterday, like with most conversations I've had with colleagues while being here, it just opens up all sorts of files in one's brain. And I think the one thing that I would like to share on this particular topic, there is so much that one can, is just to keep with the Nelson Mandela naming that this team has been working so hard on in the Gauteng City region, is as a resident, I drive to work across roads that some have been renamed after apartheid ended and some have not. And we have a researcher in the GCRO, Tembani Mkhize, who is doing research on all of this. And I will say that it remains a contentious and disputed practice. And I suspect it will remain that way till whenever. But for me, I think the interesting part about a bridge being named after Nelson Mandela in the middle of the city of Johannesburg is that it has become a place where I'm trying to find a link to Loughborough for what Loughborough is known for. So, for example, the last 2 Rugby World Cups that South Africa won. And for those who know about rugby, I mean, I don't want to rub it in, that we won.
Who's on my arm?
I think everybody who has an interest in Nelson Mandela knows those images of him in the stadium in the mid-90s, shaking a white rugby captain's hand and that team going on to win. I mean, I just get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'm not really into sport. And so, but that was a really clear message. And so what has happened with this bridge is the previous 2 World Cups that were won by South Africa by a Black captain, which is very important to us. When those teams came back to South Africa and they did their bus drive-through for all their fans, they drove across Nelson Mandela Bridge because that is a connection and a very important connection. And for those of us who are residents, who were lining the streets, hanging on the buses, screaming and dancing and partying, that's what it meant to us. This is about hope. It's about celebrating these small wins. And it's about really establishing a whole new transformed society. And that's very lofty, but that's how it feels in those moments. Mm.
Thank you, Melinda. Mike.
Well, I've got a few random thoughts,
Yes.
really, and none of it joins up properly, so you might be able to help me join it up, but I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is there is, of course, a strong relationship between the idea of naming and the idea of storytelling. And as someone who over many years spent a lot of time tramping the moorlands of Dartmoor, where I lived for a number of years, I know that one of the things I used to do as I walk, which was a very important part of my walk, was actually naming the hills that I could say, oh, that's so and so tall, that's this, that's that. There was no one around to hear me, thank goodness. But I would be naming those, and that naming of them, so it's not giving something a name, but evoking the name, was actually the way in which I was able to tell the story of the walk that I was making, the journey I was making. And then when I went back and someone might say to you, oh, where did you walk today? Oh, well, I could then revisit those names, rename the names of the landmarks in order to narrate that journey. So I think there's always been an interesting relationship between the idea of naming things and evoking names and also storytelling. In terms of naming after particular people, I suppose sometimes that naming is done to sort of honour that person as a way of commemorating that person. In some ways, it might be around remembering an event in which that person was implicated. So, if you go around London in particular and you see all the blue plaques, then of course they are on the one hand commemorating that person and all their achievements, everything they've done, but they are often related to a specific incidents in their life. This is the house where this person wrote this novel, or this is where they were born, or this is where they died, or whatever it may be. So it's often linked to specific moments of that person. And I then started thinking, well, what would I like to be named after? Well, if somebody decided to name something after me, what would I? And I thought, well, for our visit down to Lords, it'd be quite nice to have a stand in Lords. No, I think this is incredibly unlikely to happen, but nevertheless, that would be a rather nice thing. But of course, then that would only tell a very partial story about who I'd actually have to have lots of different things named after me to represent all of the different aspects of my interests and life and so forth. So I then thought, oh, well, the naming of something is only ever going to be a partial story. So that was something else I started thinking about. And I also then remembered, when we were talking about named after Nelson, that I was an undergraduate student in the early 1980s, and the Students' Union of the university I was at decided to name a big lounge, student lounge, in the Students' Union building, the Nelson Mandela Lounge. Okay, this was in the early 80s. There was, as far as I was aware, there was no link between the university and Nelson Mandela or anything. But this was a statement by the student body, a statement of solidarity with the South African resistance, and that was done by naming this. And a picture of Mandela was put up on the wall, and I don't suppose anybody really looked at it in great detail, but it became part of the language of the building that that's a meeting in the Nelson Mandela Lounge. But it was always a site of debate, and it was a site of resistance, but there was also resistance to the naming as well from certain groups of students who were not of that persuasion politically. So it became a space for political confrontation. At some point, it stopped being named that. And I don't know whether it was because a different group of students got control of the executive and decided to rename it the Long Lounge, which I think is what it was, or whether it was actually after Mandela was released from prison. That's not a reason for not dropping the name, but I think that declaration of solidarity and of struggle became less pertinent at that particular point. But it struck me that here was a place that was named after Nelson Mandela, that Mandela had no relationship with at all. There was no connection. However, it stood as a statement of political resistance and as an act of solidarity and struggle. So those are my random thoughts. I don't know how you might join those up, Yolandi, but they are random.
They are random, but they are
Yeah.
so insightful, and I think
Really?
for me that aspect of it's always just a partial representation of the person, and I haven't thought about that. So
Well, we were talking about Lords yesterday, weren't we? I mean, not many people probably realise that Lords is named after Thomas Lord. Is that people assume it's named after either a Lord or the House of Lords, but it's LORD''S, not LORDS'', and it's named after Thomas Lord, and he was the person who owned the land. He was a farmer in that part when it was farmland, and he owned the field that he let to the fledgling Marylebone Cricket Club so they could play cricket on the thing, and that place became known as Lords. Now, Thomas Lord, most people don't even know that. But even though they are, there's a Thomas Lord Pavilion at Lords to commemorate it. He is known for nothing else, in his life. Everyone forgets he was. Now, as far as Lord was concerned, as far as I know, he had very little to do. All he did was just let them use the field. So he's remembered, if anything, for doing something that he wasn't particularly interested in, probably. and yet, this is now the global home of cricket, and it's an iconic place that is named after him. He's probably there turning in his grave. No one remembers the great farming that I did there. No one remembers. All it is this flipping cricket ground. So that's the intro.
One of your random thoughts, Mike, is actually quite pertinent in relation to some of the early conversations we were having with Nelson Mandela Foundation, and actually what Yolandi brought to the table when we first started to talk about this issue of commemoration through naming. And if you recall, Yolandi, one of the early discussions was around how the younger generation in South Africa couldn't remember apartheid, and therefore the impact of Nelson Mandela's achievements were becoming quite contentious or misrepresented or misunderstood, because actually, with as time goes by, new generations of people come along, they don't remember the struggle, and therefore they're reflecting on, well, what has happened since. And so the educational context and the time factor, Mike, you were just describing in relation to that student union no longer being called after Nelson Mandela, maybe it wasn't necessary, is actually at the heart of some of the challenges that Nelson Mandela Foundation are facing now in terms of their own identity, their own changing circumstances, their own sense of mission. And as we move from a sort of agenda, which was, I think, the right terminology here, which was much more person-centered. So when the Nelson Mandela Foundation was established, it was very much about him and his personality, obviously, certainly its capability of attracting funding. Now it's much more sort of principled led, if I can use that word. And they had to manage a change from a sense of the foundation being identified with him to much more of a sense of the mission and what they would do in his absence after him passing. So these are quite interesting temporal factors, I think, that start to factor in to the sense of how, sense of purpose, really, with something like the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And again, you could have that conversation about, John Lennon's passing, or Gandhi, whatever. What happens as time goes on, and what these organisations become, and therefore what does a street name speak to when it's talking to that organisation?
And I just remembered, actually, as you were talking, not only did we have a Nelson Mandela Lounge, it was a smaller room in the building that was the Steve Biko Lounge
Ah,
as well.
there you
I
go.
don't think that's there anymore either.
Now that's a big story,
Yeah.
yeah.
Melinda, Thomas, do you want to add to this discussion?
No, I think we've covered it perfectly.
Okay. So then I want to ask Tamas. So Tamas, so coming from your urban lens, how do planning decisions determine which urban stories are then made visible or invisible?
I see that's a very good question. To me, as an urban planner, the way that we plan for a city plays a key role in terms of which stories to be told. And there are variety of reasons and ways in which we consciously or unconsciously as planners do that. One is around zoning laws. When we decide about zoning, we are purposefully deciding about where people from specific socio-demographic backgrounds are going to live. Are we pushing people from lower backgrounds and marginalized people to further away to outskirts of the city through our zoning laws? And in this way, we won't enable them for their stories to be heard, for them to be connected with people from other backgrounds. That's one way. Another way is even smaller scale interventions, such as the layout of streets, connectivity of streets. These are also key factors in terms of how we are creating an environment that is inviting, that creates sense of belonging for people. Are we making it a closed community through gated communities, or are we making it open through initiatives such as walkable neighborhoods that people can easily walk, navigate their way, increase and enhance their sense of belonging? One of the good examples of how urban planners did so wrongly in the past is what it's called redlining, which is a shameful part of American history. So if you're not familiar with it, what happened was through 1930s to 70s, urban planners, local authorities, bankers, and real estate companies, they all literally had a map of the city in front of them, and then they would draw red lines around neighborhoods that they would want typical white families to live in. And these were the specific neighborhoods that they wouldn't allow minorities, in that case specifically African Americans, to live in those neighborhoods for almost 40 odd years. And that has complete impact on those minority groups being marginalized, being pushed away from certain good neighborhoods to have access to facilities and services. And it creates this vicious cycle. Not only their stories are not heard anymore, but also the future of their next generations are going to be impacted by those zoning laws, by those extreme plannings for the future of the cities.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. So I think this then links up with my question to Melinda. So Melinda, so coming from the GCRO lens and what you do there, so how can cross-sector partnerships and observatory-driven research then ensure that urban narratives reflect the marginalized, the lived experiences of marginalized groups in planning a more inclusive urban environment?
It's a big question. And maybe the easiest way to answer that is to talk about one of our flagship research projects. And it's been something we've been thinking about over the last 2 days in terms of, you know, the formality of properly run, well-considered, ethically approved surveys versus having a conversation. And I think that is something we're also, I mean, I'm very much gaining that from the conversations in Loughborough and with the town observatory. And I'm so looking forward to spending some time, for example, with Chris later on today to talk about some of the volunteer work being done by people who live here, who want to express their heritage, express their view of living in the city themselves, and then having the expertise of this team to help them bring that to life rather than to direct it or to do it for them. And I think that's definitely one thing I'm taking home with me. Of course, we love data. There's no question in our organization. We love data. We love the ways that we can visualize data, share it and talk about it. But if we don't have those intersectoral partnerships, what's the point? then we're just shouting into a void. And so the Gauteng City Region Observatory is particularly established to be cross-sectoral and to work in partnership. I think I mentioned the word earlier, co-production is something that we're constantly driving towards. And one of this flagship project I'd like to share with you is called the Quality of Life Survey that we do every couple of years. The GCRO was established 16 years ago, and in that period, we've done 7 surveys. And it's the largest social survey that's done in South Africa. The researchers who work on it, I won't name them, are just exceptional. And, you know, from demography, geography, and so on. And they've established a set of questions. It's a long survey. It takes up to an hour to complete, and it's done face to face. Because of the demographics of our country and of our province, we can't just have it as an online survey. We would miss people who are not, let's say, registered as legal. We would miss people who don't have access to that technology. So it's face to face. It's very intensive. The field workers are extraordinary, you can well imagine. And what we've been able to do with that data is we've been able to pull together a quality of life index that we use as a measure to say things are not looking great. Trust in government is going down. Access to health services is becoming tricky. Education has become too expensive. And more recently, in the last few years, we've introduced a set of self-complete questions where the device is handed to the respondent to complete it themselves around gender-based violence, around identity. And the national census in South Africa does not include questions around gender identity or sexual orientation. And so the small but excellent team in the GCRO has had this incredible conversation with all these different partners across the country around how do we include these questions in a meaningful way? Because, I mean, not to state the obvious, but we all know if you're not counted, you don't count. And so this is something that's really important to us. And I think that's the contribution that this team of researchers brings to a large province in terms of population around saying, hang on, people have got their own story to tell, and we will reflect it through the data. And I really do invite you to come and have a look at our website. We publish everything we do on that website. You are welcome to use any of it you want to. And the raw data is also available as well as weighted data for you to run your own outcomes from that data. And I think that's really important, is if you're working with cross-sectoral partners, you need to be generous with your data. You need to make it completely accessible by everybody. The urban data science team and the GCRO are working on a way for people to be able to come online and generate their own maps. We are really well known for mapping in the GCRO. And so wouldn't that be great if you're a resident who wants to start a business, but you need to make a compelling case to get your loan? So you print out a map that shows waste services are not delivered here. We need more waste management. Off you go with your waste company to go and get your loan. And these are the kinds of things that I feel we need to do more of. They're very expensive. And at the moment, we're possibly not as popular as we could be because, you know, the data doesn't lie. And you can't say to a provincial government, everything's great. And you can't say to a municipal area, you're going to be voted for, when the data says something completely different. So that independence can be a source of conflict, but it's a creative and generative source of conflict. In the last 2 surveys, the researchers decided to be much more people-focused. So one of the last questions they asked was, is there anything you want to say? Just generally anything you want to say. And some of that feedback was so moving and so humble. You know, when people say, you know, their data says that they eat maybe once every 2 days, but then their comment is, thank you for asking me. Thank you for coming here and asking me how my life is. And I think that is a really interesting thing where most of us just want to count for something. So I'm really proud to be associated with that. And again, I invite you. There's some fun applications on the website. this urban data team have developed a village of 100 so that you can test out the outcomes of that data using that little app. And yeah, thank you, Yolandi.
All right, thank you, Melinda. So a really strong urban narrative that's coming through between Tamas and Melinda. So my last question then to Rob and Mike is, how can the narrative-based approaches to urban design and heritage help build stronger connections between people and place?
Should I take that first?
If you like, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll refer back to some of the things that have been mentioned earlier. Mike was mentioning earlier, I think you mentioned the blue plaques, Mike, in London. And one of the interesting exchanges that Mike and myself have had actually in the company of Greta, who's one of our PhD students today, where we've been talking about everyday heritage and such things. And one of the interesting sort of parallels between Mike's universe and mine is this sort of sense of, does a narrative exist if it's not performed? You know, how do we know that it exists unless it's performed? There is a way of repeating it and performing it. And that was a really interesting sort of crossover with my own field of kind of graphic heritage, I suppose. Because we could be quite easily walking around London and somebody could say to me, oh, that house is where that dancer lived, Margot Fontaine or whatever. You know, and then I might go away and revisit that space, and I might not be able to remember which house it was we were referring to. So I think what's interesting about the narrative is how maybe changeable it might be, or how vulnerable it might be to change. And I started to think about things like blue plaques as a way of fixing that narrative for a particular length of time, fixing literally to screw it into the wall. But it struck me that, you know, the sort of idea of graphic heritage is a way of fixing the narrative in time. And actually that's not just a sort of more recent realization, but you can trace the development of writing systems, for example, to the development of urban development over the last 10,000 years. You know, there's a very close sort of relationship between, you know, writing and recording about trade and exchanges in cities. You know, any sort of book on the history of writing will tell you this. So there's a close relationship between writing systems and urban development. And I think that's to do with this notion of how we fix information so that it can be then passed on and sort of taken further. So this idea of fixative or fixation somehow, I think, is really interesting. Whether it's performed, whether it's inscribed, how do we monitor that sense of how the story is maintained and has integrity, has authenticity about it, when it otherwise could be quite vulnerable, as we're learning about from Tamas's discussion around what's happening in you know, the change of road names from royalty to religion, for example. You know, how do we actually reveal those narratives in some kind of way which has a sense of purpose? I'm not quite sure if that answers the question, but it kind of helps me think about how mapping and perhaps the last thing there, as we were talking about, when you're approaching things from a research perspective, we tend to think about what, why, and how, those kind of key words. But yesterday we were talking about the where. Where is one of those 7 key words. And so location and place is sort of inherent in that word. So maybe WHERE is one of the first words or we should be including in any discussion around these issues in relation to place.
So the urbanists can shout me down here, but from my lay perspective, I think of an urban space as perhaps being characterised as a space where a significant volume of human beings that have come into a space that is constructed by humans. It's not necessarily a natural, it's a built environment. So it's a human constructed environment where humans come to work or whatever, but a place where they act and interact. And where that happens, stories take place. Yeah? So it is a place that naturally stories happen, because you've got a volume of people in a relatively small contained area. And then what gets left behind is, of course, are the traces of those stories. And some stories get remembered and they get memorialized, or they get commemorated, or they get fixed in one way or another, and yet others don't. Other stories may get forgotten, some may get remembered, but they get remembered or they exist within the memories of certain people and then get told on. And I was reminded as I was listening to this conversation today of some years ago on a, you know, when you were on a train that is inordinately delayed, and for some reason that will trigger the need to talk to fellow passengers who are likewise traumatized by what has happened, and you seek kind of human connection. And I found myself talking to an archaeologist, and I don't normally talk to archaeologists simply because I don't know many archaeologists, but I've been always interested in it. And he was he wasn't working at a university. He owned a private archaeology company, which I didn't know there were such things. But these are the people telling me that when there's a building development, oh, I think Siri is trying to join in this conversation at the moment. So he was in when there was some particularly an urban development, before anything can happen, there has to be some archaeology happen. So they might be excavating graveyards or whatever, but they might be doing something to see what's underneath there, because when you pile a load of concrete on it, that's it. So that's what his company did. They were commissioned to come in and do this before the building happened. And he said he was very interested in the work I was doing around storytelling, because he said the problem that I have with what I do with archaeology is that what you find is archaeology is really the history of those people who had stuff to leave behind, or had stuff that was sufficient quality that it has survived being placed. So inevitably there is a class dimension to what you're finding when you look at archaeology, and there's also a tendency to kind of say, oh, this is brilliant, this is a great find, look, we've got to find a whole mosaic floor. Who had mosaic floors? Not the working people, not the peasantry. They had mud floors. So there's a whole set of complications. And so he was interested in what is the archaeology that we don't recover, we can't recover. So the things that are intangible, I suppose. And so I started to think that some of the work that we're doing it's a kind of archaeology, and it's a kind of about. We were talking before about what you do. What's the capacity to listen to the stories of underrepresented communities or whatever. So in a sense, we're doing a kind of an archaeology. It's about recovery in some sense, and that's an interesting word in itself, because it can also mean covering over again, but also uncovering. So in a sense, part of what we're doing is giving the capacity to recover stories that have previously been covered or have previously been lost within that. So I was thinking a little bit about that as we were talking. I can remembering that conversation.
This has been a lovely discussion, and as always, time flies when you're talking. So I think I'll bring this panel into a close at this point, because it is a hot day, and I'm sure everyone would like a breath of fresh air as well. But at this point, if anybody in the panel has a final reflection that they would like to make. Rob?
It's a lyrical one then. Mike, you used the word traces. Not only are we thinking about urban places, narrative spaces, we're also interested in graphic traces.
Yes.
Wow.
Brilliant.
We have
our title.
All right, well, I will try and follow Rob. But yes, just to say, I think one of the interesting new areas of work in the GCRO is under our research theme called Histories and Futures. And yesterday, Rob said something that really sparked something in me about how many of us, and I include myself in it, when we talk about heritage, we think of the past, but that actually heritage is about now and the future. And so that is a little brain bug that I will be mulling over for some time. And just a little addition of something that is happening in the GCROs. Our head of research, Graham Gotts, is very clear about defending the space for curiosity. and saying we can't just be completely focused on the problems of the day and the solutions that need policy advice. We also need to allow researchers that space for curiosity. And so our executive director, Rashid, has been leading a few projects under Histories and Futures around a narrative, around how people connect with our urban space. And so he's done really great work on urban Muslim spaces. And he has just initiated a project on race related spaces, because of course, coming from apartheid South Africa, we may be 30 odd years down the line, but changing those racial spatial patterns will be with us forever. And the key difference in this is he has invited in every member of staff, not just researchers, to join that research team who is a member of that race or who identifies as that race. And so we have our receptionist is part of co-producing that research, our finance and office manager is part of that research team as well. And I think that level of human connection and of really talking about our urban spaces in a narrative way is about so much more than just communities, respondents and researchers. It also is just about everybody within your organization, if we are really promoting inclusion. So thanks for letting me add that.
Thank you, Melinda. Tamas?
Thank you. So my final note is a question to myself and the audience about the future of storytelling and heritage assets in the era of AI and in the rise of these digital platforms. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I'm very curious to know whether these type of platforms are helping us to create more inclusive communities, bringing people together, or they're also failing again in terms of creating this divide between those people who have access to these platforms and those who don't. So I'm interested in discussing this over lunch as well.
Thank you, Tamas. Mike?
I was just thinking about what Rob said about traces there. And I simply thought, actually, maybe that's, and I'm not going to give you another list of words rhyming. But I was thinking the problem around traces, it sounds quite a passive thing. And I was wondering whether, I'm not talking about traces, I'm talking about ghosts that might need reawakening. And then I was thinking about, okay, are places then haunted by narratives that may or may not appear? You know, and apparitions sometimes. So you can tell I haven't really thought this through fully, but
Mike, we can introduce you to Vern Harris at Nelson Mandela Foundation, who wrote a book on ghosts in the art and talks about that very topic. Okay, so.
Oh gosh, good for you.
Brilliant. So thank you to our lovely panel. And I would like to invite all of you to please ask questions to the panel once we're now done. If there's questions online, Kieran, I will ask you to please send that list of questions through to me and I will circulate it to the panel to answer, since we have absolutely run out of time. And that's a thing for today. Thank you for everyone being here in person and online. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.